The Marine Accident Investigation Branch just released their interim report for the sailing superyacht Bayesian. I have a flight to catch in a few hours, so there's not going to be a lot of editing, but we're at least going to go through this report together. So let's just dive right in. Following the accident, the Marine Accident Investigation Branch initiated a safety investigation into the circumstances of the loss of the Bayesian. This safety investigation is being conducted in parallel to a criminal investigation being led by the Termini Imerese Public Prosecutor's Office in Sicily, Italy. That criminal investigation has restricted the safety investigation's access to the wreck and other material elements of primary evidence. Consequently, this interim report is based on a limited amount of verified evidence. The circumstances depicted in this report may alter following the release of the evidence held by Italian authorities at the time of publication or following examination of the wreck. Some information about this incident not otherwise available to MAIB has appeared in the public domain, and there has been much speculation as to the circumstances of the accident. The safety investigation has purposely not included information it has been unable to verify. The MAIB's ongoing investigation is considering all aspects of the accident to determine its causes and circumstances. These include Bayesian's design, stability, escape routes, operation, and emergency procedures. The safety investigation has also considered the forecast weather and that experienced during the accident, as well as available guidance to mariners on actions to be taken in extreme weather. Narrative. On August 14, 2024, the privately owned and operated Bayesian sailed from the port of Milazzo for a short excursion around the Aeolian Islands and the north coast of Sicily. There were 12 guests and 10 crew on board. The intention was to disembark the guests on August 19th before proceeding to Naples for a period of maintenance. On August 18th, the Bayesian was anchored at Cefalù on the northern coast of Sicily. And here they just provide the plans of the Bayesian. So this is the flying bridge deck and the upper deck. This is everything that you could see from the surface here, and they're mostly focusing on the upper saloon, the flying bridge up here at this location, and then the stairs down to the wheelhouse. I know that these are a lot of terms to remember here, but just keep these in mind for when we dive further into this report, because they are going to reference these locations. Here's one big area here of concern is the engine room. So just keep that in mind. This is on the lower deck, and this is towards the stern back here. And this is the cabin of the chief engineer. This is the cabin of the owner here. So the rest of the guests, G1, G2, G3, 4, 5, they're all right here in this area, all in the lower deck. And then you got the galley right here, crew accommodations. So just keep these in mind when we dive further into this report. With the wind increasing, it was decided to motor towards Porticello, 25 nautical miles to the west. So they knew that this wind was increasing and that it was coming. So they went into Porticello to anchor for the night. This was both to shelter from the forecast weather and to allow for easy disembarkation of guests the following day. At 21:24, Bayesian anchored to the east of the main breakwater. The centerboard was in its raised position, which is also what we're calling the keel. The keel or the centerboard. It's called the centerboard on a lot of these larger vessels. A lot of ships that we work on, they call it the centerboard. So they very, very clearly state right here, the centerboard was in its raised position. The yacht Sir Robert Baden-Powell was also at anchor nearby, which is the only other sailing vessel that you could see in the photos moments before the Bayesian sank. The seas were calm and there was a very light wind from the northwest. Thunderstorms had been forecast, and those on board Bayesian could see occasional flashes of lightning away to the west. Bayesian's skipper left instructions to be woken by the overnight watchkeepers, deckhands DH1 and DH2. If the wind speed increased above 20 knots, or if there were signs that the Bayesian was dragging anchor. Having checked the latest weather forecast, the skipper went to bed. By dark 30, this is 30 minutes after midnight, the last guest had retired, leaving deckhand 1 and the evening steward, S1, on duty. At 1 a.m., deckhand 2 took over watch from deckhand 1. The wind at this time was noted as being no more than 8 knots, and there was no sign of the Bayesian dragging anchor. At 3 a.m., deckhand 2 noted the wind as being at 8 knots from the west, but thought that the thunderclouds and lightning seemed to be getting closer. At about 3:30 a.m., Two of the guest 1 and guest 2, awoke but remained resting in their cabin. Then, at approximately 3:55, Deckhand 2 videoed the advancing storm and posted it to their social media feed. You guys may have seen that clip going around. It was like the last video that was taken on the Bayesian. Deckhand 2 then went onto the deck and closed the forward hatches and cockpit windows to protect Bayesian's interior from the rain that had started falling. Deckhand 2 noted that the wind had picked up 30 knots and was broad on the port bow. Bayesian was now listing to starboard, and Deckhand 2 thought the vessel was dragging its anchor. At around 3:57, both Bayesian and Sir Robert Baden-Powell started dragging their anchors in the rapidly worsening weather. At around 4 a.m., Deckhand 2 ran below and woke the skipper. So this was 5 minutes after they had noted the wind being at 30 knots. So things are moving pretty quickly here. Together, they returned to the flying bridge. At about the same time, the chief engineer woke up. Having experienced bad weather at anchor before, the chief engineer got up and walked to the engine room to prepare the vessel for maneuvering. So he's getting ready to start these engines so that they can maneuver and work with the weather rather than just being a sitting duck waiting to get blown over. After making sure that all 3 generators were running, the chief engineer went to the wheelhouse to start the steering pumps and hydraulic pumps for the controllable pitch propeller. The chief officer, chief steward, chef, and stewards had all been awoken by the yacht's change of motion. They dressed and made their way out of the crew accommodation, which is at the lower level towards the bow. At this time, the Bayesian was estimated by those on board to be listing between 10 degrees and 20 degrees to starboard. The owners started to make their way to the flying bridge to see if the taxis that were arranged for 8 a.m. would have to be canceled due to the weather. So, I mean, they know that the weather is getting bad here, and they're even calling to see if they have to cancel the taxis that they had ordered for the guests and to get maybe some of the crew off board. The chief steward secured some loose items in the crew mess area, then went to the upper deck to secure the other items. The CO went to the flying bridge, where the skipper gave an instruction to the rest of the crew to be woken as the anchor was dragging. Returning below, the chief officer told the bosun and deckhand 1 to go on deck and secure any loose items and stand by for further orders. The chef was in the galley, stowing cutlery, pots, and pans, and shouted "Good morning" to the chief officer and nearby stewards. So he too was in the lower level preparing the kitchen and stowing away pots because those are all banging and clanking around. The Bayesian was lying in the wind about 60 degrees off port bow and moving at 1.8 knots south-southeast of its original position. Sir Robert Baden-Powell was also dragging its anchor at a similar rate in a similar direction, which we can see right here. So this is where the Bayesian was anchored, and this is where the Sir Robert Baden-Powell was anchored, and you can see how quickly they drift off position. And this is where Sir Robert Baden-Powell ended up. And then here is where the Bayesian currently rests. 2 of the guests, G3 and G4, had been awoken as the Bayesian took on the list and decided to head into the saloon with their baby, which is who we're calling G5. The chief officer returned to the flying bridge and briefed the skipper on a few activities. The skipper told the CO to check if the chief engineer had started the engines and pumps so that they could maneuver Bayesian into the wind. Arriving in the wheelhouse, the chief officer saw the chief engineer there and was informed that Bayesian was ready to maneuver. The chief officer then shouted up to the flying bridge to inform the skipper. The owner, G3 and G4, carrying G5, arrived in the saloon in the wheelhouse area as a rain-soaked CS came in from the upper deck. As the skipper prepared to move Bayesian into the wind from their position on the flying bridge, the wind suddenly increased to more than 70 knots. The awning over the flying bridge ripped from port to starboard. At 4:06 a.m., Bayesian finally heeled over to 90 degrees to starboard, taking less than 50 seconds to do so. So instantly, they're kind of leaning in the wind, and then it just goes flat. People, furniture, and loose items fell across the deck. The generators shut down immediately, and battery-supplied emergency lighting came on. So at least they had some battery-supplied emergency lighting so they can try and get out of this death trap as soon as possible. The skipper, G4, the owner, the bosun, and steward 2 were all injured, either by falling from things or things falling on them. Deckhand 2 had been thrown into the sea from their position by the helm on the flying bridge. In their cabin, guest 1 and guest 2 used the furniture drawers as an improvised ladder to exit the space, escaping along the internal walls of the central alleyway and climbing into the saloon area. Steward 1 and Deckhand 1 climbed up the walls of the forward staircase, exiting from the crew mess area into the wheelhouse. There was no indication of flooding inside the Bayesian until water came over the starboard rails and within seconds entered internal spaces down the stairwells. So as we discussed in our original Bayesian video, those stairwells leading down from the main deck inside were a pretty massive area for water ingress. Now it says the chief engineer managed to exit through the port forward wheelhouse door. Once clear, they helped deckhand 1 out before heading aft to launch an emergency position indicating radio beacon, also known as EPIRB. So when you put these in the water, it's going to notify the Coast Guard and first responders so they can get to your position as quickly as possible. So this was, they launched 1 of 2 on board from its position on the port aft quarter main deck. Deckhand 1 stayed by the port forward wheelhouse and, reaching down through the open doorway, lifted both steward 1 and then steward 2 onto the upper deck. Looking down through the door, DH1 cannot see anyone else, so the 3 of them made their way aft into the sea. Separately, the chief officer had found the owner and pushed them through the cascading water up to the skipper on the flying bridge. The chief officer and skipper managed to evacuate guest 3 and guest 5 by the same route. So that's when they got the baby out of there. The bosun and deckhand 2 climbed down into the wheelhouse and lifted guest 1 and guest 2 into the flying bridge, where they joined guest 4, assisted by the chief officer and skipper. With Bayesian rotating to starboard and sinking, the chief steward, bosun, and deckhand 2 found themselves in an air pocket by the closed port forward wheelhouse door. With the assistance of the injured guest 4 on the outside, they were able to open the door and escape. The chief officer, who had been swept to the back of the saloon and into another air pocket, dived down to open the sliding doors at the aft end of the saloon and managed to swim clear of the vessel. We don't know if water came in through those sliding glass doors that we've looked at before, but they were able to open them and swim out of them, so perhaps they weren't locked. It's not very clear, but the skipper organized the abandonment from the flying bridge and instructed the guests and crew present there to swim clear of the mast and boom as the vessel was sinking. By 4:22, the chief engineer had launched the EPIRB and was sitting out on the hull near the rudder. They noted that the wind had eased and the Bayesian was only a short distance from shore. The chief engineer heard shouts from the skipper and jumped into the sea and swam towards the gathering survivors. The chief steward counted those present and checked for injuries. Deckhand 2 improvised a tourniquet for G4's gashed arm, and G2 made sure that guest 5 had a cushion as a floating device. Some of the survivors were treading water and others held on to some cushions that had floated free from the Bayesian. Guest 1 was using the torch from their phone to search on the water for other survivors. The skipper and deckhand 1 swam to Bayesian and attempted, without success, to release the port aft life raft from its stowage. What a scary feeling that must be, to try and release the life raft, but only to be unsuccessful in doing so. The chief officer swam to the port forward life raft and released it from the sinking wreck. They towed the life raft to the gathered survivors. At approximately 4:24 a.m., the life raft was inflated and deckhand 1 boarded it and assisted the survivors in the water to board. From the life raft, the chief steward saw the bow of the Bayesian rise up and then sink below the surface. The chief officer and chief steward began organizing the life raft and delivering first aid to the injured people on board. The chief engineer searched for flares, and deckhand 1 and the skipper tried to raise the alarm by shouting at and then paddling towards Sir Robert Baden-Powell. The Bayesian had sunk in approximately 50 meters of water. So it says here that the bow of the Bayesian rose up and then it went back down. If you guys have ever seen any vessels that have taken on water, the bow usually serves as an air pocket, and even sometimes the vessel, if it sinks, the vessel will still have its bow out of the water. So that's kind of what they're referring to here. The bow raised up and appeared to sort of rise out of the water, and then it kind of ended up gently falling down. The skipper on board the Sir Robert Baden-Powell noted that despite the application of engine power, their vessel had dragged anchor around 400 meters in 11 minutes. So Sir Robert Baden-Powell, they actually had their engine going. Despite that, despite motoring into the wind, it still dragged anchor about 400 meters in 11 minutes. That's an insane amount of movement. You can only imagine that what would have happened if that anchor got stuck and they were unable to move. It would have probably went down just like the Bayesian. The yacht's crew initially thought that the Bayesian had been put to sea to avoid the sudden storm. Their skipper briefly saw a dark rectangular shape descending into the water, later believing this to be the Bayesian's bow sinking. So at first they thought that the vessel had just been blown completely away. Like, that's how massive this weather event was. They actually thought that the vessel had been blown out of sight, like out of view. But then they recalled seeing this dark rectangular shape, and then they later realized that that was the bow. At 4:34, Bayesian's chief engineer fired a red parachute flare from the life raft. Despite the winds being calm at the surface, the flare was carried sideways as it rose up into an area of stronger wind. The chief engineer used the life raft's torch to signal towards a hotel on the cliffs above them, passing cars and Sir Robert Baden-Powell. At 4:43, the chief engineer fired a second parachute flare that was seen by the crew of the Sir Robert Baden-Powell. Responding to the flare, the skipper of the Sir Robert Baden-Powell dispatched its tender towards the visible lights of the EPIRB and life raft. On arrival, the tender's crew transferred the life raft's occupants on board, and at 4:53, the tender returned to the Sir Robert Baden-Powell. A brief search was made of the accident site to check for other survivors. At 4:56, the tender from the Sir Robert Baden-Powell returned to the scene with the Bayesian's chief engineer on board to search for other survivors. After approximately 20 minutes, the tender returned to the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, and the Bayesian skipper joined the crew on the tender to continue their search. Sir Robert Baden-Powell's skipper called to the local Coast Guard to arrange to transfer the survivors to shore. The accident on Bayesian resulted in the deaths of 6 guests and 1 crew member. All of the bodies were subsequently recovered by the local authorities. Environment. The investigation examined the published weather forecast for the period, some actual weather observations from the night of August 18th and 19th, August 2024, evidence from local CCTV footage, and witness testimony. This was all combined with the output of an Italian weather report for the area. The Meteo France weather bulletin for the western part of the Mediterranean Sea, Met Area 3 West, issued at 0900 UTC on Sunday, August 18th, mentioned a deepening low-pressure feature moving towards Italy from the Gulf of Genoa during the period. Specifically, this 24-hour forecast included the Lipari Sea area, which is the northern coast of Sicily and offshore areas, and predicted westerly 3 or 4 winds. Temporarily, the northwest overnight, then increasing 4 or 5 at the south end. Now, the weather forecast read here, seas smooth or slight, becoming slight or moderate in the second part of the night. There was forecast to be poor visibility and showers or thunderstorms. Early Italian weather forecasts ahead of the accident predicted intense and persistent rain, mainly in the form of showers or thunderstorms, with storms being accompanied by strong wind gusts. At 2100 UTC on August 18th, Italian forecasters issued a gale warning of northwesterly gale force 8 winds for Sardinia and Corsica, with the associated isolated thunderstorms with local gusts for Sicily. This was updated and reiterated at midnight UTC on August 19th, 2024. At 3:52 on August 19th, 2024, around 5 nautical miles to the northwest of Porticello anchorage, winds were recorded to have suddenly increased from around 5 knots to 41 knots from the northwest. These strong winds were associated with a storm front that passed quickly towards the rugged coastline near Bagheria and Porticello. This was observed on a nearby vessel's navigational radar. Several CCT cameras in Porticello showed an intense squall of wind and heavy rain arriving, throwing debris around violently before moving on. This intense squall was associated with lightning strikes, thunder, and very poor visibility. Land weather readings recorded at 5-minute or hourly intervals captured a peaking of wind strength as the intense squall passed. So pretty much what that is saying is that the squall and the wind was occurring at the same time. So it wasn't just wind that was moving in, it was also this heavy rain and downpour. The investigation commissioned at the Met Office, the UK's National Meteorologist's Office, to analyze the weather conditions over the seas north of Sicily on August 2024. The Met Office study concluded that a trough of low pressure transited the area overnight on August 18th and 19th, 2024. It noted that local data suggested that there was a large amount of convective available potential energy, or CAPE, C-A-P-E, in the atmosphere. Sufficient wind shear was evident in the atmosphere, and the conditions were borderline for the development of supercells. High inshore sea surface temperatures may have also contributed energy to the development of weather systems. The Met Office of Satellite Imagery indicated that the mesocyclonic storm was demonstrating the properties of a significant supercell with associated downdrafts. So this was like a super cyclone that was moving into the area with downdrafts coming down. So not only is it like swirling around, So they're unable to really work and maneuver into the wind or work with the weather. They can't really pick a direction to go, but also there's these downdrafts. Once it leaned that Bayesian over, it just pushed that mast down and held it there. And possible near surface winds in excess of 100 miles per hour or 87 knots. So these guys were in like a full blown hurricane. It says here that the study concluded that the mesocyclonic storm was highly likely, with an associated supercell being probable. It also included the tornadic waterspouts and downdrafts that were possible, where local winds could reach extreme hurricane force well in excess of 64 knots. Such tornadic waterspout features could be of very limited horizontal extent. These would be waterspouts of 50 meters to 100 meters wide. That's pretty wide. So I'm not a meteorologist here, but this, I believe, is the location for the Bayesian, and this would have been the weather event moving in. So you could just see how massive that was and how quickly that moved in. Within a matter of 20 minutes, it covers nearly half of this bay here. If anyone did study meteorology or has more information on everything we just went through, please feel free to give us some more details in the comments, and I'll pin that comment. So thank you. So this is the Bay of Palermo right here. So on these radar image areas right here, this is the area that we're looking at here on the radar. All right, so let's go over the stability real quick. The Bayesian was built in 2008 as Sailing Yacht Salute. Stability Information Booklet (SIB) was submitted for approval to Ensign, the then large yacht service of the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. On July 3rd, 2008, the SIB was approved against the requirements of Section 11 of Merchant Shipping Notice (MSN) 1792. This is the Large Commercial Yacht Code. The approved SIB was required to include curves of statical stability, or GZ curves, for specific loaded conditions. It says here that the Bayesian's SIB contained curves for the sailing conditions when at maximum load, contractual full load, and in the light load condition. In all three of these conditions, the centerboard had to be lowered, which we already know that the centerboard was raised. Now, these angles of vanishing stability for the three conditions recorded in the SIB were 91.4, 92.3, and 84.3. Now they took the information in the stability booklet and combined it with all the meteorology information that we just looked at, and they ran simulations, and the study determined that the angle of vanishing stability in this condition was 70.6. So once the angle of the vessel leans over to 70.6, that's pretty much a point of no return, and it's not going to come back up. Now, here's the result of the study that they were just mentioning. If anyone would like to interpret this data and provide a better interpretation of this data for us in the comment section, then I'll pin that comment so we can appreciate this data a little bit more. So this is the summary of their investigation so far. The investigation has established the timeline of events on board Bayesian and documented these to the extent possible with the information gathered. The stability information presented is based on the documents recovered and information gathered, and the assumption that the yacht's condition when lost, also known as the lost condition, was similar to the loaded arrival condition, i.e. 10 consumables on board. The effects of wind on the mast, boom, rigging, and upper works of Bayesian have been assessed using the available information on the yacht's construction and equipment. Through the desktop assessment that they provided, the safety investigation has established that in the assumed loss condition, once Bayesian heeled over to an angle greater than 70.6 degrees, or also known as the angle of vanishing stability, there was no chance of return to an even keel. The investigation also established that in the assumed loss condition, wind speeds in excess of 63.4 knots on the beam were sufficient to knock Bayesian over. It is possible that Bayesian was similarly vulnerable to winds of less than 63.4 knots. These vulnerabilities, when in the motoring condition with the sails lowered, the centerboard raised, and 10% consumables on board, were not identified in the stability information book carried on board. Consequently, these vulnerabilities were also unknown to either the owner or the crew of the Bayesian. So they're saying in the stability booklet that the conditions the Bayesian faced that night were not available in the stability booklet. The Met Office study and local observations indicated the probable transient presence of hurricane force winds well in excess of 64 knots at the time of the incident. These accidents were sufficient to knock Bayesian beyond its angle of vanishing stability. So they're currently working on the salvage of this vessel, and they've already had one fatality during this operation. Unfortunately, a diver was killed while cutting and working on the mast. So let's hope that they are able to safely salvage this vessel and get it back to port so this investigation can be completed. Based on this interim report, it's been determined that the Bayesian was easily knocked over in this massive super cyclone freak weather event.